having me here, although I really wish that the topic would not have become more prominent since 8 or 9 days, but at least it's a good situation that we can discuss this topic, the topic of populism, not just in a European perspective, as it is self-evident for the Institute for European Studies, but also, and somehow, as Stefan indicated, still catering also to my interests in US American history and society in a transatlantic perspective. Now, after the election of Donald Trump to the American presidency 1 week ago, the distance between Europe and North America seems to have shrunk and grown at the same time. Politicians, media, and civil society in Western Europe have reacted on a scale between unpleasant surprise and outright shock. And there is much speculation about a major shift in transatlantic relations, about the loosening of the classical post-war relationship by the incoming administration that is certainly warranted by Trump's rhetorical signals during the campaign, if not yet by his actions. From the point of view of the liberal public in Germany, the UK, and elsewhere in Europe, their own countries and governments are now called upon to defend democratic regimes and lifestyles against the temptation of authoritarian right-wing rule that is looming in Washington when a ruthless populist takes the reins of power. And yet the success of populist politics in the United States in many respects only reflects and repeats what has been going on across large parts of Europe, including the presumably so enlightened western half of the continent for many decades. Less than 2 years ago, it looked as though populism was the European pattern of political discontent in the beginning of the 21st century, while the problem of American political culture, both in its self-diagnosis and in the view from outside, was much rather the ever-widening gap between the two major political parties and their constituencies, the loss of common ground, and, at least from a liberal perspective, the radicalization of a conservative right, as epitomized in the rise of the Tea Party movement towards the end of the last decade. The rise and success of Trumpism has therefore ironically brought profound commonalities between American and European politics to the fore, and indeed commonalities between the social and cultural underpinnings of politics. Democracy as we knew it is in a state of crisis on both shores of the Atlantic Ocean, and populism is the ghost that haunts Americans and Europeans alike. Now, in my talk this afternoon, I should like to address this situation with an attempt at understanding populism, both in a broader historical perspective and with the categories of a historian, not of a political scientist, and as a Western phenomenon. In other words, as an expression of fundamental changes in advanced Western democracies over the past decades, reaching back into the 1960s and 1970s. I will look at patterns of political culture relevant to the crisis of democracy and the rise of populism, for example, in the emergence of anti-elitism and the transformation of party systems, which reveal both differences and similarities between the American and the European trajectory. Needless to say, the populist landscape in Europe is wide and rugged in itself, as are economic conditions and cultural foundations out of which the populist challenge has grown. My prime European case is Germany, and I will mostly leave aside post-communist countries such as Poland and Hungary, and certainly Russia, not to speak of Turkey perhaps, or other countries on the eastern or southeastern periphery of Europe, in which rightist authoritarian governments with different kinds of popular appeal are, well, to say the least, testing the limits of democracy and the rule of law. And yet there is a case to be made in comparison with the United States for a Western European brand of populism that stretches from Britain and France to the Netherlands and Germany, from Scandinavia in the north to Italy in the south. Obviously, this is a huge topic, and what I'm not going to discuss, among many other relevant factors, which we can embark on in the discussion, is the impact of media and technology, especially the internet and social media, on the production of illiberal mindsets, the vulgarization of political discourse, and the proliferation of populist politics. Instead, I'm going to focus in the major parts of my talk, true to my origins as a social historian, on the much debated issue of the social origins of populism. You may have wondered about the imaginary invalids in the title. Beyond a literary reference to Molière, this phrase seeks to capture an essential enigma in the quest for an explanation of populism. Who are its followers? Who are its voters? It is often assumed that populist attitudes such as anti-elitism, xenophobia and nationalism are an expression of marginalized groups in the age of globalized capitalism, an understandable and maybe even legitimate act of protest against exclusion, disempowerment, and injustice. Now, far from rejecting economic factors, and indeed an important part of my considerations will be devoted to them, my main argument, nevertheless, is about cultural mechanisms rather than economic inequality. The sickness often is, to put it provocatively, an imagined one. Both the alleged sickness of liberal democratic societies and the sufferings of the populist electorate. While I'm trying to advance a complex multi-causal model for an historical explanation of populism, I mostly see it as a reaction to the cultural dynamics in a new stage of modernization of Western societies, as a cultural backlash against the processes of liberalization rooted in the 1960s, and as an attempt at coping with an age of uncertainty and ambiguity through the reaffirmation of traditional values. I will proceed in 5 parts of different length and give you a brief overview. Number 1 will be on anti-elitism and anti-establishment politics. Then in the second part I'll turn to political culture and party systems with my commonalities and differences between European and American patterns. Part 3 is devoted to questions of socio-economic change and the power and limitations of this kind of explanation. Part 4 will turn to the issue of cultural change and advance the argument of cultural lack in the explanation of populism. And number 5, finally, will be a brief conclusion: populism in an age of ambiguity. So, number 1, patterns of anti-elitism and anti-establishment politics. The critique of elites, especially of economic and political elites, has not been invented by populism, only exploited and exacerbated. And it is in fact a major asset. We should not forget it is a major asset of democratic societies. Therefore, it is not surprising that its traditions are historically stronger in the United States than in Europe. European political culture, in the transition from the early modern to the modern age, from monarchical to aristocratic to more egalitarian conceptions of society, had retained its hierarchical and deferential elements, as historians, especially of early modern Europe, often call it, deferential elements not only into the industrial period, but arguably into the post-war era of the 1950s and 1960s. Germany is a special case in point, with its authoritarian habits that had supported fascism, and all the more profoundly came to be challenged in the radicalism of the student movement. There were other radical student movements elsewhere, I know. American politics has been characterized by anti-elitist traits since the Jeffersonian revolt against federalism, and even more since the age of Jackson. Resentment against big cities, big business, and big politics has run deep all over the 19th and 20th centuries, and in fact constituted a major element in the appeal of the original populism of the farmers' and small businessmen's protest movement that culminated in the 1890s. What then has changed recently? While the anti-elitism of the classical democratic age had mostly been advanced by the political left, whereas the right had stuck to its elite-abiding patriarchal notions of social order, anti-establishment politics has transitioned to the right and construed new arguments about democratic, liberal, indeed leftist elites who in their progressive agenda setting allegedly have lost contact with the aspirations of ordinary people. At the same time, however, leftist anti-elitism has been fueled by growing social inequalities in the transformation of capitalism since the 1980s, with the emergence of a new class of super rich in the post-production financialized market economy. The story is complicated and it's important to see both the overlap between right and left populism and the critique of elites and establishment, as well as the market differences. While leftist populism mostly projects its critique of elites at the 1%, as the Occupy movement so suggestively put it, the elite threshold for right-wing populism is much lower, so to speak, on a hierarchical scale of society, as it often begins with the academic upper middle classes, with professors or journalists as major agents of public discourse, or poisoned graduate students, perhaps. So, in a word, with us. Whether the gap between elites and ordinary people has indeed grown in the past 3 or 4 decades is hard to tell, and subject to definition and type of elite under scrutiny. The very rich have become even richer from the perspective of the lower as well as the middle classes, and even more so in the US than in Europe. The divide between the working class and the middle class already is much more difficult to assess. Political elites have probably become more plutocratic and in that sense more estranged from the chances of common people in America, but not quite so in many European countries. Recruiting patterns of the political and administrative class in France, for example, through the system of Grande École, have remained stubbornly resistant vis-à-vis both capitalist and egalitarian transformation. In Germany, meanwhile, access to the political class has long been relatively open and might have become less elitist, in fact, in recent decades, for several reasons, with the entry of the amateur politician into the political arena in East Germany in the wake of reunification, just think Angela Merkel, and so many East German Ministerpräsidenten, while in West Germany the Green Party has opened alternative paths for political careers from the margins, albeit kind of different margins than the perhaps socially disprivileged in a proper sense. With regard to political and some other functional, however not economic elites, it is quite safe to say that indeed populists are imaginary invalids, or at least the estrangement is on their part and not with the politicians. Certainly, demands from civil society have increased expectations about transparency and responsiveness in representative democracy that politicians are now often unsuccessfully trying to catch up with in both sides of the Atlantic. Again, the dynamics of the left and of the right may be understood as communicating vessels. The crisis in representation, or rather the crisis perhaps in understanding representation, has been nourished on the left by older traditions of Marxist critique of liberal representative democracy, as well as by the more recent quest of progressive movements for the introduction of more elements of direct democracy. The idea of a homogeneous interest of the people, hindered in its fulfillment by the egoism of elites, is a common denominator of left and right populisms, a new Rousseauism against which pluralist notions of interest and representation have been increasingly difficult to advance. So, you see, as Stefan announced, I'm making a liberal argument. Yeah. So, new Rousseauism with, think of volonté générale, the will of the unified, homogeneous will of the people, or the 99% of the Occupy movement or the left. Still, there is a very real element in the overwhelming feeling of non-representation. Its roots are in the rapid dissolution, and now comes the social historian, the rapid dissolution of the corporatist and associational society that had characterized social order in the age of classical modernity, from the times of Alexis de Tocqueville into the 1970s. In this system, everyone, or rather every white male citizen, came to be represented in a variety of social roles. As Catholic or as a member of a Protestant denomination, as a farmer or industrial worker, as a member of a trade union or some voluntary association, and in multiple of those roles. Closely knit communities and a high degree of identification with the leaders, the elites of those milieus and associations, secured a feeling of individual empowerment to the rank and file that has indeed been lost in an era of radical individualization, most of all for the working and lower middle classes. the upper middle classes, or we can cope better in a different way with this radical individualization. The bonds that connected them to their local and intermediate power brokers have been destroyed, with the result of a sense of loss of control and a massive wave of distrust in those who now operate without their consent and connection. Second part, patterns of political culture and party systems. Before we further pursue this argument at the crossroads of manifest reorganization and patterns of social order and their cultural repercussions, I should like to take a brief look at another aspect of the political embedding of populism, namely its organizational side and its place in party systems in particular. If populism can be understood most fundamentally, in an abstract sense, so to speak, as an attitude towards society and politics, it may pursue its goals in various organizational forms. But still, the rise of populism, especially in Western and Central Europe since the 1980s, is inextricably linked with the erosion and sometimes even collapse of traditional party systems that had lent stability to the post-war period, and in many cases could be traced back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when social democratic as well as Catholic parties emerged. The stability of these constellations, be it two-party or multi-party systems in different European countries and political culture traditions, has been shattered as a consequence, among others, of the evaporation of social milieus and the retreat of a corporatist and associational society. The close link between the end of a pillarization of society, the breakdown of party systems, and the rise of populist movement parties in their wake is most obvious in countries such as the Netherlands, with its long-standing pattern of verzuiling, as the Dutch call it, or Italy, where confessional, ideological and cultural camps had shaped the post-war party system in a similar way. In Italy, populism came to power with Berlusconi and his Forza Italia movement party in the 1990s, and although Italian democracy has indeed survived Berlusconi's long reign, so there's hope, there's 4 years, 8 years, there's some afterwards perhaps, and moved back to more classical trajectories in many ways, the organization of interests and the party system, and so there's perhaps not so much hope, have never recovered from its collapse, and will, for the foreseeable future, remain in the populist mode of post-ideology and ad hoc mobilization, even in the era of Renzi and others. In many other European countries, however, party systems have rather undergone a process of gradual erosion and transformation, as has been the case in Germany since the 1980s. In such cases, populism has organized in right-wing parties that sometimes were formed on the basis of smaller parties that already existed, as was the case with Jörg Haider's remaking of the Austrian Liberal Party, FPÖ. Mostly, though, populist movements have created new parties that were positioned on the extreme right of the political spectrum, as with Jean-Marie Le Pen's Front National in France, or much more recently with the German Alternative für Deutschland, the Alternative for Germany, or AfD. German political culture since the 2000s has not been characterized by the high degree of polarization of the United States, where the populist appeal is a hybrid of right-wing ideologies and a more centrist promise, in fact, to bridge the cleavages in culture and society. On the contrary, Germany stands out for its consensual and centrist political culture, with a post-ideological overlap of the former foes, Christian Democrats and Social Democrats, embodied in a series, as you know, of grand coalitions, technically since 2005, but de facto and in political culture since 2002 and 2003, since the Hartz reforms in the remaking of the German social system and more. Different from the United States, populism in Europe has often occupied a space on the political right that had been vacated by the liberalization of conservative parties. And you see, this is a completely different pattern in the United States. Yeah? A place that had been vacated by the liberalization of conservative parties, such as the CDU in Germany. And the AfD, therefore, is both a rather traditional conservative party with a bourgeois and sometimes even elitist outlook, think of the professorial initiative and leadership in the making and direction of this party, and a modern populist party with a broader appeal to the disconnected and petty bourgeois. So in that sense, from a sociological point of view, it's two parties in one, actually. In structural terms, the American case of Trumpism rather seems singular in the Western world, or I'm waiting for other cases that you present to me that are not yet known to me, and yet it exemplifies similar issues in the transformation, and that's I think a core point and common denominator still across the Atlantic, in the transformation of conservative politics in the 21st century. So populism is, in fact, very much about the transformation of conservative politics in one way or the other. Its singularity in the United States is in the hijacking of a major existing party, and not a minor party such as the FPÖ, but one of the major players in an otherwise extremely stable two-party system. Donald Trump has been the parasite thriving through and from his host, the Republican Party. This pattern is remarkable since there is a well-established pattern of third-party challenges in the United States. In United States history since the 19th century, that Trump may have chosen to follow. Indeed, the original populism of the 19th century, organized as a third party, as the People's Party or Populist Party as it was then called. Trump may get his credit for realizing that these efforts had never carried someone to the presidency, and that the internal crisis of the GOP, its own rift between moderate establishment and conservative zealots on the grassroots level, had made it ripe for his own assault. Populism hence may flourish in a variety of organizational ways, and with quite different positions in a country's party system. However, two features run through those varieties. Number one, a previous damage done to the party system by the realignment of voters beyond their traditional cohesion and milieus. And number two, a crisis of conservatism as a political ideology and cultural worldview that has come under attack, has come under pressure with the attacks of both economic and cultural liberalization at the end of the 20th century. And with that, we are with number three, patterns of socio-economic change. So why do people vote populist or even anti-democratic? Why do growing shares of the population in countries that we used to think of as among the most educated and most enlightened in the world fall for a political program and propaganda that is xenophobic, racist, misogynist, and nationalistic? Well, some answers, of course, in recent political theory not accidentally proposed that we should go beyond democracy to systems that privilege the educated again. And in the German context, I'm often joking with my wife, who's also a historian concerned very much with Prussian history, about we should reintroduce the Dreiklassenwahlrecht, the Prussian three-class voting system, in order to disenfranchise the stupid. Yeah? And there is a serious strand of political theory that is now going in this direction, as many of you know. I might discuss this later. The core question, not my suggestion though, the core question of the popular attraction of the populist appeal probably is impossible to answer in any satisfactory way. Obviously, it is more than an empirical riddle that would only need more hard data to be solved, although we need more hard data, obviously, on that. It is answers will be dependent on fundamental persuasions, on political ideologies, and deep-seated worldviews of every one of us. Liberal optimists will assume that everyone will be following a path of enlightenment and rationality once impeding factors have been remedied. A lack of education, gross social inequalities, or a distortion of rational discourse in the Habermasian model by the intrusion of power into social life worlds. Skeptics, on the other hand, won't be so sure about all of this. They would argue that people think and behave in irrational manners anyway, and that we shouldn't assume, as the history of the 20th century has demonstrated in ample ways, shouldn't assume a Whiggish autobahn to the universalism of liberal democracy and cosmopolitan transnationalism. Perhaps the most widespread explanation for people going populist is the leftist and progressive narrative of economic marginalization. It appears in American as well as in European political thought and points to major socio-economic transformations during the past few decades, transformations that have very much been discussed by the historical professions, by contemporary historians in recent years, far beyond the economic and financial crises that have shaken the Western world from 2007-2008. Although in that view, the last 10 years certainly have aggravated existing issues of social inequality. The roots, however, are often found in the turnaround of the mid-1970s to early 1980s. That is, in the end of the post-war era of prosperity, in the end of the Trente Glorieuses, with the retreat of Keynesian economics and the rise of neoliberalism. Just 2 weeks ago, the editorial of The New Yorker, at the same time, many of you have read it, I'm sure, at the same time a powerful endorsement of Hillary Clinton for US president, succinctly summarized this narrative. Anger and resentment in this reading are vibrant within, quote, a white working class that has been losing ground, unquote, and for which, quote again, a disconnected political class, particularly within the Democratic Party, so self-criticism, has failed to convey any sense of empathy. End quote. The New Yorker even conjures the original populism of the late 19th century by boldly claiming, and I quote again, we are, and that's really has to listen to this voice really, yeah? We are in the midst of a people's revolt, the editors of the New Yorker say, a great debate concerning inequality, the hollowing of the middle, globalization's winners and losers. We cannot dismiss the message because we deplore the messenger. While the moderate left in Europe would probably overall be somewhat more reluctant with adopting this narrative, so certainly insofar as it lends legitimacy to the populist revolt, public intellectuals on the radical European left echo and reinforce that view. A talk by Slavoj Žižek 3 weeks ago at Berlin's Humboldt University has been announced as Rage, Rebellion and Power. I haven't attended this talk, just following the announcement and what one can, things that one can read from Žižek, of course. In the face of populism, Žižek doesn't come to the defense of liberal democracy, and why should he, as one of the last remaining Leninists, but mourns the fact that the very legitimate anger by the people as it is channeled into populism does not lead into a real rebellion and revolution. Now, this raises problems of political theory and political philosophy that I'm not going to follow tonight. Suffice it to say that the question of the legitimacy of populism is a delicate one. Between the, as we've seen, as I've tried to indicate with this quotation, between the scylla of giving some credit to racism and xenophobia in the name of larger power structures and inequalities, and the corruptness of what Germans nowadays often call Wählerbeschimpfung, the revilement of voters who ought to be held accountable for their illiberal views and ballots, with the, in turn, danger of overlooking the origins of anger and hatred. Here we are again with the title of my talk, Imaginary Invalids, question mark, of course. In an empirical and historical perspective, it is very plausible that the economic dynamics of the past half-century have contributed to the susceptibility of certain groups to the populist message. But the connection often is more complicated and less obvious than the standard account of the neoliberal assault assumes. The end of the Trente Glorieuses in the 1970s has ushered in a period of relative stagnation in wages and living standards, while income from capital and financial transaction has dramatically grown and sometimes skyrocketed. For the most part, however, this is a relative experience, and living standards in 2015 are much higher for the lower middle classes when compared to the relative scarcity of 1975. Perhaps, or somewhat certainly, one should say, more so in Europe than in the United States, where this economic stagnation of the middle class, also the lower middle class, is more obvious than in Europe. But it's not true for Europe. The story, for example, is a different one for Southern and Eastern Europe. to regions that only began their trajectory of growth and mass prosperity in the new democracies and within the European Union. For all their current economic calamities, and I think that is really a point that is often forgotten about the European situation in historical perspective, Greece and Spain today are worlds apart from their state of mostly rural, utter poverty in the mid-1970s. So it's really become a middle-class protest, whereas in the 1970s these were countries of utter poverty. A similar case could be argued for Poland and Hungary, and even for East Germany, the former GDR. While the post-communist configuration in many ways has its own variables, Spain and Greece are, not accidentally, politically different, because they are these prosperity latecomers, as they have witnessed major populist movements on the left rather than on the right. And this has to do with this different socio-economic story, I believe, with Syriza and Podemos. In the older industrial countries that are more susceptible to right-wing populism, deindustrialization has indeed hit the working class hard. And the link to the success of populist politics is obvious. In the American Rust Belt, with blue states such as Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin that Donald Trump captured on November 8th, as well as in old industrial German regions, for example, in the northern part of Baden-Württemberg and southwestern part of Germany, where the AfD scored major victories in the state elections of March 13th, 2016. Indeed, the two direct mandate, the mandates in the Landtag that are coming in the German system through the first past the post part of the system, were scored in Mannheim and Pforzheim, two old industrial cities. However, if white males in those regions are most vocal in today's populism, it doesn't mean that they were the sole or prime victims of deindustrialization, the quintessential white male working class that appears in the New Yorker and has become almost topical in American discourse. When factories shut down in the American Great Lakes region, as well as in the German Ruhrgebiet, migrants and minorities were at least equally hard hit. Gastarbeiter from Italy or Turkey in Germany, and African Americans who had come to the north with the Great Migration just 1 or 2 generations earlier in the United States. It was predominantly men who lost their jobs in coal mines, steelworks, and auto plants. But rational, and again, this I think is a part of the story that is often forgotten or not really highlighted enough, but rationalization and the export of production to the southern periphery of the respective continents, to the Mexico, for example, in the United States, to Spain, Morocco, Turkey, in the case of Europe, and to East Asia also, of course, has probably even more engulfed industries that relied on female wage labor, such as optics, electrical appliances, and most of all, textile. Not all losers of globalization have become permanently marginalized, and not all of the marginalized are turning their frustration into hatred and xenophobia. Therefore, we should be very careful with this kind of socio-economic, political, immediate linkage. Women in particular may have been more successful in securing the new chances of post-industrial service society than men. Or are they, I think in many cases also an open empirical question, or are they just less vocal and less aggressive in uttering their political opposition? And they are still often in low-level service jobs. And the poorest and most economically marginalized have, according to preliminary data, rather not voted for Trump last week. We discussed this last night already. Trump voters are much more typically to be found in the lower middle classes, in the second quintile of economic stratification, and besides across the complete range of income and education. Indeed, this is what we would expect from historical evidence of voters' support for right-wing movements. In the crisis of the Weimar Republic, unskilled and unemployed voters gave strength to the KPD, the Communist Party of Germany, while the NSDAP overwhelmingly, though this argument of course has been modified in many ways, benefited from middle-class, lower middle-class votes. Hence, it is important to ask questions for economic change when looking at political attitudes, but the answers may well go beyond economics. As the concepts of deindustrialization and globalization are not sufficient in explaining the new populism, the larger notion of the emergence of a post-Fordist society may be helpful, as it directs attention to other factors such as gender and organization. In the Fordist paradigm, the male breadwinner took center stage, a skilled worker who with his wage could support his whole family, wife and children in Detroit and elsewhere. The inability to do so in a post-Fordist economy has done more than material harm. It has come as a cultural shock to a deeply patriarchal worldview. Meanwhile, the destruction of Fordist work environment, such as assembly line production, has served as a catalyst for the decline of trade union strength in Western democracies since the 1980s. But the flight from organization is a much larger trend, also beyond the sphere of work and labor, and rooted at least as much in massive reorientation of cultural preferences from the collective to the individual. Ought to be very clear and somewhat provocative again, the very same people who are angry at loss of control and loss of touch have massively embraced a hedonistic, individualized lifestyle for themselves. At the same time, a gap has opened in educational attainment and its consequences for economic achievement and social prestige, increasingly pitting the academic upper middle classes against the non-academic lower middle and working classes, and producing resentment against the elitism and the increasingly liberal worldviews of the educated classes. And this conflict as a economic, so to speak, conflict with regard to education and prosperity attainment on the one hand and political views on the other hand is more pronounced in the United States because the academic academic middle classes in the United States are, let's say, more homogeneously leftist, progressive, democratic than is the case in European societies, where there's a broader spectrum of leftist, moderate, leftist, liberal, conservative worldviews in academia also. This is where we finally have to turn to patterns of cultural conflict and in understanding populism. So part 4, patterns of cultural change. Without losing sight of economic change, social inequality and their repercussions, populism may be defined as a pattern of cultural resistance, namely as resistance against liberalization of society. The cultural liberalization of Western societies, and in extension, of course, across the globe, to which populists oppose, or at least which they do not instinctively grasp or rationally understand in relation to their own lives, is in a complicated relationship with the dynamics of economic liberalization, often summarized with the concept of neoliberalism. But it would be a mistake, both conceptually and historically, to conflate those two liberal forces, economic and cultural liberalization of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, or to reduce cultural liberalization to a functional byproduct of larger neoliberal power strategy, as neo or post-Marxists often tend to do. Historically, the origins of cultural liberalizations, as we understand it today, brought forward by the protest movements of the 1960s, the student movement and new feminism in particular, have preceded the global economic crisis of the 1970s and the paradigm shift in political economy from Keynes to Friedman, from demand to supply. The pursuit of individual liberties and personal autonomy and cultural liberalism sometimes, of course, dovetails nicely with the neoliberal idea of economic individuals who are completely set free from social bonds and obligations. At the same time, though, both stand in stark opposition against each other, with the neoliberal quest for order and regulation running directly counter to the idea of grassroots organization and creative self-realization in the Berkeleyan tradition, the 1960s, of individuals. In any case, culture wars have emerged as a salient feature of a new populism in the United States as well as in Europe, that promote a politics of cultural and social nostalgia and even reveal an aggressive gesture towards modern society. Populism in this regard, and I'm taking up the argument that I've made before in an earlier part of my talk, has become the heir to conservatism. And the populist fight may indeed be understood historically as a second wave of protest or cultural backlash against the cultural liberalization and value change that had started in the 1960s and half a century ago prompted the rise of a new conservatism. Rather early, practically, as we now know through the work of historians such as Lisa McGurr, simultaneously with the rise of the leftist protest movement, and about a decade later, only after the turmoil of 1968, or even after the economic watershed of 1973 in Western Europe. The cultural agenda of current populism has certainly been influenced by more recent events, such as the mass migration of Middle Eastern and African refugees, by the challenge of radical Islamic terrorism in the wake of 9/11 and the Western war against terror, and by new stages of cultural dynamics of Western societies, especially with regard to minority rights and sexual politics. But the core catalogue of grievances refers back to the 1960s and 1970s, with three larger issues of particular prominence and symbolic significance. First, a rampant anti-feminism that comes in variations and degrees from the more traditional conservative housewife ideal promoted by the German AfD to the aggressive misogyny of Donald Trump, but almost always constitutes, I would argue, a core element and not just some, as it appears at first glance, some obscure irritation in the populist agenda. Second, a vibrant nationalism that is not only, and in many cases not even primarily directed against political transgressions of the nation state like the European Union, but is anchored in the cultural ideal of ethnic homogeneity and hence articulates its reservations against immigration and the ideal of ethnic, cultural and religious pluralism in modern societies. Third, if perhaps somewhat less important, populism also converges in its rejection of the ecological paradigm change that has transformed Western culture since the 1970s. The denial of climate change, or at least the refusal to act politically on it, currently loom large on the populist agenda, more so I think in the United States than in Europe. But it reflects deeper resentment against the redefinition of values along ecological lines of sustainability. In the eyes of a historian, therefore, there is something like a cultural lag in the populist mindset. Almost a century ago, American sociologist William F. Cockburn had introduced the notion of cultural lag in an attempt to explain the belated reaction of societies to processes of material and manifest technological and whatever change. The pattern of late reaction applies to both economic and cultural changes that go back several decades by now. Manufacturing plants have been closing, assembly line jobs have been lost to other parts of the world since the 1970s and 80s. And it was often the fathers of those angry today who lost their jobs in the Fordist economy, not those who are complaining of their job loss. Of course, in many cases, they too. Women have attacked patriarchy and claimed their autonomy as individuals, their equal share and standing since more than a generation, and yet the pursuit of female equality still doesn't seem to be culturally digested in significant shares of the male population. However, one should be careful not to overemphasize the image of continuity in cultural liberalization since the 1960s. The beginning of the 21st century not only witnesses a second wave in cultural backlash, but also a genuine second wave in the dynamics of cultural liberalization itself. While half a century ago, equality and autonomy for marginalized groups, for women and minorities, had been the rallying cry, the pursuit of equality and autonomy has now been extended to minorities that were largely out of sight 2 decades ago, at least in mainstream discourse, people with handicaps and LGBT people. The new politics of sexuality in particular has challenged the notion of normality. The notion of normality is at stake in different ways compared to earlier emancipation movements in the 20th or even the 19th centuries. Liberals and progressives sometimes too easily take these cultural redefinitions for granted. we should pause a moment in order to understand the enormous historical significance of the barriers that we're breaking up today. For example, with the conception of marriage beyond heterosexuality. If liberals demonstrate understanding vis-à-vis economic disruptions in people's life, think of the New Yorker editorial, again my example for tonight, they should also take cultural disruptions into account and, without compromising on their principles, give others who are less privileged time to accommodate. Conclusion. Populism in an age of ambiguity. Populism flourishes in an age of ambiguity. Above all other variables in a complex configuration, economic changes and new inequalities, the dissolution of social milieus and the erosion of party systems, the distrust of elites and the crisis of representative government, the change of media and technology that I have left out for this talk. It should be understood as a search for order, to borrow on Robert Weeby's famous phrase for American history in the 19th and early 20th century, in an apparently unorderly world, as an attempt at securing boundaries in a historical situation when boundaries disappear. So populism is about disappearing boundaries, quite literally, but also in a larger figurative sense. How can we control our lives and maintain security with open borders, literally? How can we care for ourselves in our local microcosms in the shadow of global elites who prosper in their unbounded existence and air travel and everything? But the irritations which translate into populism reach still deeper. Ours is an age of apparent paradox, of fuzzy realities. How can there be nation states and a European Union if the latter does not seem to transform itself into a sovereign federal state, yet is more than a federation of nation states? So it's both at the same time. It's like Schrödinger's cat. Yeah, we live in a Schrödinger's cat world, I would argue, in the beginning of the 21st century. Women should be equal to men, but should we stop thinking in those bounded categories of gender at all? And that's what's irritating people. Trans categories are all around in terms of liquid modernity, as Zygmunt Bauman and others have called it. The West may be under attack from outside, but the real stress comes from the inside, with a tension between a hugely dynamic reinterpretation of Western ideals that we're currently pursuing and the difficulties of many in the West, whatever their economic situation may be, in keeping pace with this ongoing revolution. Ironically, populism has brought the West closer together again on both sides of the Atlantic. America and Europe are in the very same predicament. They cannot stop, and they must not stop this revolution in the name of freedom and rights, of participation and inclusion. And yet, they may have to listen to the voices of those struggling to keep pace. Thank you very much for your attention.